Morning, Chris. How you doing today?
Good morning, Ron. Doing well. How about yourself?
Doing really well. It's another great day.
Yep.
Today we're going to take on part two. We were talking about the difference in part one about GDPR and CCPA, right? Because they're very different. And it always seems like the EU and Europe leads the charge on these restrictions, right? It always seems like, and maybe it's the fact that they're united. And so it's easier for them to all move together. But in the US, we just are slow to act, right?
Yeah.
It just seems like everything is pulling teeth to get enough people to finally agree and go, oh, we can do that. And then it takes someone like California usually to lead the charge, right? As they usually do, which is what they did with the CCPA. So in part one, we really dove into what the differences are between the two, but we didn't dive deep into them. So today we're going to dive deep into the GDPR and CCPA. If we can get through both, we'll get through both. Otherwise, we'll break it into part three. And today will really be focused about GDPR. We want to make sure we cover them in depth. So, Chris, I know we talked lightly and a high level about the GDPR, but, where did it come from and what makes up the GDPR? I mean, what's its premise? What's its guiding principles?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would just say in general, there was a lot of data sharing that was happening, and it was something that, I'm sure that we don't even know the full extent of the data sharing that was going on that wasn't clear to a consumer or to a business that was interacting with another business that was capturing all this information and possibly sharing it in ways that many people would not appreciate or could even be considered to be nefarious,
Right.
and sort of to their disadvantage that data was being shared. And so the just general intent of GDPR was to give that transparency. And ultimately, it was drafted by the EU, but it is global, and it's basically tech neutral. One of the interesting things about it is it has these 7 principles that kind of guide it, and it's not just online. It's really meant to be any kind of data sharing in general. So that's also helpful to understand the full scope. And it's really anyone interacting with a business or essentially consumer in the EU. You've got to be aware of this and apply these principles. And we'll get into the weeds on the nuances of it, but the principles are really helpful to understand. And so probably the biggest thing just overall is this concept of transparency and basically having a lawful and fair use of data that is transparent. Also making sure that there's a limitation of the purpose of the use of the data. So a lot of times you'll see on different sites, cookie usage is sort of something that they're going to ask you about based on different use scenarios or purposes, as well as data minimization. So we literally want to reduce the amount of data to only that which is absolutely necessary for that purpose. Which is a really precise way of thinking about it, right? We don't want to accumulate unnecessary data that could be sensitive. It needs to be accurate. There has to be a limitation on how long it can be sort of retained or stored for. And then there has to be integrity and confidentiality so that data isn't accessible just as a use case to everyone within an organization. It should be based on role, who has access within an organization to someone's data that they've agreed to share. And then also accountability, a overwatch or a validation that, people are following the rules that are set forth, these principles for GDPR. So there's a lot there to unpack, right? And I think it would be great for folks to just kind of go through some of these principles and talk about some of the examples that really help paint the picture of the use cases and some of the nuances of that, if that sounds good.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it seems like it's almost they came in and I know I probably shouldn't say this out loud, but it's like they came in and went, oh, Google is capturing every piece of information about every person and storing everything they possibly can and potentially selling that data to everybody else. So everybody can market to everybody. And, about all their secrets and all their preferences and everything. And the EU
Yeah.
went, yeah, well, I don't think we want to do that. And they kind of came in and put some governance around organizations collecting data, dealing with people in the EU. And that's basically what they did. They came in and said,
Yeah.
sorry,
In social
you could,
media overall, right? Like
yeah,
not just one player, but I think they all kind of figured out they had to monetize these giant companies that were social and they had a lot of users, but they didn't really monetize them well. And they kind of figured out that they could do this really focused advertising, and it really creeped a lot of people out, rightfully so.
yeah,
And like we're going to talk about, it's a lot more in scope than just that. But I would agree. I think that was
yeah,
basically what drove this to happen.
yeah.
So
Yeah, I mean, and being a marketer, I understand, man. I think it was brilliant. I think
yeah,
grabbing that much data is absolutely genius, right?
yeah, yep,
I mean, that's the whole concept of personalization that we've talked about in other videos, right? Is
yeah,
how do we better? And Google has a good intent at heart, right? Google's intent, in my opinion, for servicing their consumers anyway, is how do I serve better data, more accurate data that is exactly what my visitors want, right?
yep,
It's what they do with the search. It's what they do with the index. It's what they do with the ads. I mean, everything they do is around that.
that's right.
Um, but yeah. Okay. So one of the things that I wanted to mention is, like with HIPAA, we always talk about the hhs.gov site, right? That's where HIPAA is kind of governed and where all the rules are. For GDPR, if you want to know, it's actually at the gdpr.eu site. Now, I've been to that site, done a little research on that site. It's a little bit cumbersome, a little bit hard to navigate. So there's a better site, in my opinion, if you're wanting to look at the rules and look at the guidelines to ensure that you're adhering to them. There's another site that's gdpr-info.eu. In my opinion, that site's a little better because what they've done is they've actually just taken the guidelines, and instead of all of the marketing and all of the fluff and everything else, they've taken it all away and they've made it in an actual online documentation format. So you can literally go in, you can see the chapters, you can get through the principles, you can read the information, you can actually find it. There's a great search engine on top of it. So and I'll put it on the screen right here, gdpr-info.eu. All right. So Chris, what if I, as a business, do not adhere to GDPR and I'm fined? Are there, like, I know you and I've done some research on the OCR and HIPAA fines and how big they can be, but what are do you have any idea what some of the fines could be if we violate GDPR, what the EU assesses?
They can be quite large. They can be tens and tens of millions or tens and tens of millions of euros or dollars. Um,
Pounds, yeah, whatever,
yeah,
right?
exactly. They've been quite large for different, social media platforms in particular.
Yeah,
Um, and I don't think the intent is to punish any business, and there's language around sort of, that scenario of being able to operate a business successfully, but ultimately there has to be some consequence to get the behavior to change. And so there are fines, and they're, relative to business sizes, they're pretty substantial. A lot of organizations that we work with that are international, or they're going to have any kind of international interaction, which is just about any business that's of size, it's generally going to have that. You're going to be dealing with fines eventually if you don't address this. And the nice thing is, it is pretty straightforward and simple to address baseline GDPR. And if you're able to show that you're doing something, even if not perfectly, but you're doing something, that can really help.
yeah.
um, it makes a huge difference, right?
Yeah. Yeah. It's almost like the way the US is trying to enforce the HIPAA guidelines, right? They don't want you to go out of business and spend more money trying to comply to HIPAA. They want you to make an effort and to follow the guideline. And that's why even on HIPAA, they call them guidelines, right?
Hmm.
With GDPR, I mean, the one thing they've tried to do to limit that is they've tried to keep it to 2% of a company's annual revenue is what the typical fines are. So it's it's going to sting, but it's, if you're a huge business, it's going to sting more. If you're a smaller business, it's not going to put you out of business. And that's kind of the point.
Yep.
So I think the real part where you and I need to dive in is we do so much HIPAA that how does GDPR, and we've done a few sites that have the GDPR engine in our HIPAA sites, right? We've had to deal with that. I've heard there's 3 different types of data. Can you talk a little bit about the data and the types of data that GDPR covers when it comes to medical?
Yeah, this is pretty interesting. So with GDPR in particular, there's the EU GDPR. There's also a British version of this. Great Britain has its own version. So just bear that in mind. This is specifically for the EU with GDPR, and it's basically data concerning health, genetic data, and then biometric data that it specifically talks about in the regulation. And, one of the things that we always like to look at is sort of where is all of this going? So you're not just looking at what the regulation covers right now, but also, are you going to be in Great Britain? Are you going to be in another country that has a different regulation, but it's proximate, it's similar, so that you can sort of accumulate that capital expenditure to comply with the EU GDPR, but also get that other compliance built in at the same time. So that's something to think about whenever you hear this specific scope. But health data is pretty large scope, right, Ron? And I think it might help folks to understand some examples of what we mean by that, genetic data and biometric data.
Yeah, it's a lot more, and they get very specific on the data. So GDPR, unlike HIPAA is very different than GDPR and the purpose of what they're trying to do with the data. With this data, it's more about, hey, there are exceptions to this. I think the word they use is if there's a disproportionate effort to try to comply, then you don't necessarily have to. So for example, let's say you've got a small organization and you're a clinic, and in order to do business, you have an intake form, you get all the information, and then a patient comes in and says, we want you to remove us. But in order to comply with legal medical regulations, a doctor may have to record every patient that they've prescribed every medication to in every date and time stamp. So Ron could go over there, see a doctor, get prescribed Oxy, and then go, hey, forget me, because I'm going to go to another doctor, get some more Oxy and get some Oxy and get, okay, well, they don't want to allow that to happen. So Ron can't just go in, see a new doctor, and then get a prescription for his back pain and then say, I need you to forget me now. Typically what that means to be in compliance with GDPR on, let's say, an e-commerce site or a doctor-patient portal, I can't forget the patient. I have to keep patient information. But what I can do is I can get rid of a phone number. I can get rid of an email address, so I can't spam them, and I couldn't sell their data and have somebody else spam them. So for me, a simple GDPR compliance activity, if I had an online portal and they say, forget me, is I have to keep the medical information, the treatments, the appointments, the insurance, what they've paid, the drugs that I've prescribed. I have to keep that. I can't get rid of that. So I can't forget my patients, but I can forget their phone number. I can forget their email address, so I can no longer spam them. I couldn't give their information away. And so that would be an easy way to comply. So a lot of times the compliance is around how much effort is it going to take you to comply, and what can you do to forget their information. The other thing that's interesting, Chris, is if, let's say I'm a general practitioner and I'm servicing a patient, and then they get diabetes and I refer them to you as a hematologist. And then they come back, and I send them to you as a referral. And then they come back to me and say, I want you to forget my information.
Mm-hmm.
I actually am on the hook to reach out to you and ask you and make an effort to forget their information as well. So it extends to the information you've shared. So what they're trying to prevent is they're trying to prevent these organizations that collect this massive amount of data and then sell the data to everybody, right? And then not be on the hook or be responsible or accountable, which is the seventh principle, right? Not be on the hook for sharing that data and making an effort of bringing that data back. Another one that's interesting, can you talk briefly about, I understand this concept of history, right? We don't want to get rid of data, right? We don't want, there's significant importance to having stuff, right? Especially when we're doing clinical trial data. It's important to know all the times that, patients that took this particular drug, it worked well, and patients that didn't. There's importance and a significant amount of value to just information, right? So talk briefly about this concept of, because GDPR protects that, right? GDPR doesn't come in and just go, hey, you can just forget everything about me. It's like, no, we're trying to protect your information so it can't be shared and you can't be spammed, but your information is important, right?
Yeah.
So talk briefly about that, because that is protected and actually excluded in the GDPR.
Yeah, and this is something that you want to make sure you get good advice. We're speaking in generic terms about this to just try to characterize something for you to look at, and I would say that's true of this whole video. So make sure you get expert advice based on your specific scenario. But with that said, archiving data, and that's pretty vague. So what specifically that meets that criteria, I would say it sort of boils down to like not sharing it for use and not sharing it for basically marketing purposes and other purposes like that. So archiving the data, and I think you gave some great examples, Ron, about why you would archive that data. Public interest, something that might be necessary for the good of the public at large. Again, that isn't going to be abused in the traditional sense that, sharing it for marketing purposes or other reasons would. Scientific or historical research, there could be some data that really is important to be able to validate whether a treatment worked properly or et cetera. And then statistical or defense or legal claims. And these are definitely nuanced as well. But generally speaking, the big output here is that you're going to want to make sure that you are 100% that, yeah, this actually meets those criteria for an exception. But there are exceptions. And, that's the big thing is it's not really a catch-all. You want to understand enough about this that you can sort of have the general lay of the land so that you're not destroying data either, right? You don't want to go to the extreme and just destroy all of the data to be in compliance and then not be able to comply with other laws and regulations that are a part of your industry, right?
Yeah.
So,
especially when it comes to medical treatment, right? I can't just go to a doctor and go, I want you to forget me. And then the doctor has to get rid of all the prescriptions and all of the treatments and all of my lab work and all of that stuff. That is extremely important for, as Chris just kind of went through, some of that scientific and historical data, so that if I go to another doctor and then that doctor says, can I go get your records? They can go to the other doctor and get my records, right?
Right.
And so, yeah, medical definitely is an interesting, and online e-commerce are definitely some of the interesting exceptions where we have to walk that line. And fortunately, it's not a black and white. There's a lot of gray, just like HIPAA, right? There's a lot of gray in the middle where it's like, if you're making an effort to comply with GDPR, if you're removing their email address, if you're removing their phone number so that you can't market to them, but you're keeping the rest of the information because it's important to how you do business. It's important to how you can treat that patient. It's important to comply with regulations of distributing controlled substances. There's so many things that could apply to your business. Those are the things that you want to look into. All right. So is there any last thing, Chris, you want to tie off on GDPR, or should we break CCPA and we'll dive into that on part 3?
Yeah, I think we break that out. And I would just say in general with GDPR, it really helps to have an expert who understands your business and can evaluate these nuances and exceptions and details with you. And whether it's us or another team that you can work with that can really get into the weeds around your business, we highly encourage that. This is a absolute necessity for most businesses that they take this seriously. The fines are increasing dramatically. So we're always happy to help. Feel free to reach out if you have any questions. And otherwise, thanks for watching, and we'll look forward to seeing you in the next video. Bye for now.
Bye for now.